Hello, everyone. Welcome to our presentation on Japan. We're mainly focusing on the feudal era to keep it within the realms of period 3. So, first off, I want to mention the Yamato period, which actually begins in period 2, right? So, it's important for us to realize how China and Japan are interacting at this period. If you remember from our discussions on China in the Tang and Song dynasty, you may remember that China referred to itself as the Middle Kingdom, which suggests that the Chinese believed that they were in the center of the world and everyone should revolve around them. But despite the power of the Tang and Song dynasty, Japan, Korea, and Vietnam had their own cultural traditions. So we'll explain the Japanese ones today. China is still very highly influential over its neighbors, and other South Asian societies find themselves more forced to adapt to the rise of China and to grapple with the changes that China's predominance brings to their lands. But Japan has an advantage because it's an island nation that it can remain more isolated than many other societies. But still, the Japanese do adopt some elements of Chinese culture. For example, they begin to follow Confucian practices. The Japanese have their own civil service exam, but we will discuss the differences. It adopts a written character system that's similar to Chinese. However, the spoken Japanese language is very different. Buddhism also spreads to Japan and is very influential over its culture. And the Japanese also adapt different styles of Chinese art and architecture. We'll look at some examples of those. And it also adopts similar government structures as China, especially in terms of its bureaucracy. So let's discuss Prince Shotoku first. He was a prince in the 6th and 7th centuries, so now we're getting more into period 3 proper. And at this point, China actually had a major presence in Korea. So that actually troubles the Japanese government because proximity-wise, Japan and Korea are very close together. So Prince Shotoku rules the Yamato region of Japan, and he attempts to implement Chinese practices in Japan. So, for example, he writes a new constitution that consolidated all of Japan under one ruler. Previous to that, Japan was essentially divided in its government. These different families ruled different parts of Japan, so it was much more of a decentralized government. So Prince Yamato attempts, or Shotoku rather, attempts to change that. Also, Prince Shotoku argued for a centralized government with a merit-based system of selecting bureaucrats, very similar to China, obviously, and he hired skilled Chinese laborers to come to Japan to share their knowledge in various crafts and construction. So that is one of the reasons why you see a distinct Chinese flair in Japanese art and architecture. The court sent Japanese nobility to China to study Chinese culture, and the prince rather promoted Buddhism and Confucianism as supplements to Japan's traditional religion, which was Shinto, and introduced woodblock printing to Japan. So all influences directly from China. So after Prince Shotoku died, we undergo a brief period of reforms known as the Taika reforms. So the successor of Shotoku adopts these reforms starting in 646 CE, and one of the first things he does is he issues new laws that put all farmland under government ownership, which means that all the tax revenues are going to be paid directly to the central government, not the nobility. So this is a direct challenge to the much more decentralized political system. It's a challenge to feudalism, and it's a major blow to the power of feudal lords and a large step towards creating a more centralized government. There's also an attempt here to create a bureaucracy, but this is a very short period, but at the very least it introduces a window to future attempts to reform the Japanese government to a more centralized one, again, influenced directly from China. After the Taika reforms essentially end with the rise of the Fujigawa clan in 710 CE. So the Fujigawa is a family network, and they take control of the Japanese government, and they move the capital city to Nara, which is very close to modern-day Osaka, which is a very, very large city today. So it's important for us to realize that the present-day capital, Tokyo, was not always the capital of Japan. Uh, Nara was built in the same architectural style as China's capital city at the time, Chang'an. So you can see very distinct Chinese features in its architecture there. And I also couldn't help but include a photo of a deer because actually there are wild deer in Nara, Japan, and if you're a tourist, you can essentially go up and pet them. I've never been, but I thought that that was really fascinating. So the Fujiwara clan continues in the tradition of Prince Shutoku, who remember that he came right before the Taika reforms, and it continued to model itself after the Tang dynasty in China in many different ways. After the Fujiwara clan, we have the Heian period, which is another return to decentralized government. So you can see a pattern here. In period 3 in Japan, essentially we're dealing with a feudal system and a decentralized system. The attempts to centralize the government are brief and fairly rare, right? So the aristocracy ultimately is very strong at this point. So in 794 CE, the emperor decides to move the capital back to Heian, not Nara, where it was previously. This is a place where the emperor can get more support because that's where he is located. But the emperor of Japan was essentially a puppet. He was a figurehead ruler. He didn't really have real power. The real power remained with the Fujiwara family, rather, which suggests again that feudalism is really the most important political economic end of social structure. Uh, in the post-classical Japanese period, which is this, again, power rested truly within whatever family had the most control, and in this instance, it's the Fujiwara family. The Heian period leaders mainly tried to emulate China's political structure, but they were unsuccessful. So again, this is really a struggle between the emperor and the feudal lords for power, and it looks like mostly the feudal lords end up gaining more power in this struggle. The government during the Heian period attempts to introduce an equal field system. You might remember that from China during the Tang and Song dynasties, sort of evenly distributing land among the peasants. But this plan fails because the nobles have a lot of influence over the government, and ultimately they don't want an equal field system because it doesn't work to their advantage. There also was a merit-based bureaucracy introduced during the Heian period, but it was different from the Chinese merit-based bureaucracy because the civil service exam in Japan was only open to certain social classes. So really, it's not a meritocracy at all. And we do remember in China, there were some limits to the meritocracy, right? I mean, ultimately, to study for the civil service exam, you probably need to have some free time. You probably need to have some money saved up. But ultimately, the Japanese civil service exam was even more unequal because automatically certain people were disqualified from taking the test. In the Heian period, again, I know this is somewhat redundant, but we do see that it adapts some of the same cultural practices as the Chinese. They adopt a character system, which is similar to Chinese, although the spoken language is very, very different. They also adopt Chinese styles in their art. We'll look at some examples soon. And they adopt Buddhism. However, they adopt something called Zen Buddhism, which is different from Chinese Buddhism and Indian Buddhism. And I'll explain that in just a few moments. And again, just as a reminder, they adopt a civil service exam, but not the same as the Chinese. Okay, more things about the Heian period. So, the Heian period is characterized by continued growth among the nobility, right? They tend to gain more and more land. We could actually compare this to the Roman latifundias, if you remember that from period 2. Also, this is a real golden age for Japan. Arts and literature flourish, so we know for sure that that is certainly a good thing for especially the wealthy in Japan. Other things, there is a very elaborate court life, which is not surprising because in the European feudal system we saw that as well. The people who had money tended to really engage in lavish ceremonial parties. They wore very fancy clothing, and they ultimately indulged in the finest foods. They bought art, jewelry, all those things. And this, of course, is facilitated by the elaborate trade networks that are developing at this time. If you have enough money, you could buy goods essentially from all around the known world. And in terms of images, I wanted to show you some examples of art and other things that are flourishing. So this is a painting. It's actually a set of this from a series of paintings called 36 Views of Mount Fuji by Katsushika Hokusai. And then on the right here, we see this is actually sliding doors here. And it's an image of a plum tree, and that's by an artist called Kanu Sanraku. And then on the upper right, this is a traditional court dress during the Heian period. So again, you see that the nobles that actually attend court are very elaborately dressed. During the Heian period, we also see elaborate writings that are published. So the two most famous ones that you should know are the Pillow Book by Sei Shonagon, which was written during the 10th century, but it was published in the early 11th century CE. And what this was essentially a diary. It was written by one of the court ladies to the Empress Consort Taishi, and it included lists, different opinions by the author, personal thoughts, and collections of poetry. And it's considered a great example of elaborate and essentially very cultured, very skilled writing at the time. And then also there was a very famous novel that was published right around the same time, just a few years afterwards, by Lady Murasaki Shibiku, and this is called The Tale of Genji. Murasaki Shibiku was a noble woman and lady in waiting at the time, and it's a classic tale of love and the passing of time, and it also provides a window into the life of aristocratic Japan. So, if you were literate, you could actually read about this and essentially take in a taste of some of the finest Japanese culture. And also during the Heian period, we see that the Japanese are developing some more distinctly Japanese culture and less influence from the Chinese. Just another slide on Lady Murasaki Shibiku. She also makes contributions to Japanese writing. So there's a specific script that was called kana, which was traditionally adopted by female writers, and then men wrote with the more traditionally Chinese characters, which are referred to as kanji. Minamoto Yorimo was a very important shogun. So we're going to talk about the shogunate system of government now. So this is a period of military rule. A shogun is a military ruler who essentially reigns supreme. So even though there was an emperor during shogunate periods, ultimately the true power rested in whoever the shogun was. And Minamoto Yoritomo was shogun during the 12th century, and he establishes the Kamakura shogunate, which lasts until the 14th century. So essentially, this lasts almost to the end of period three. Um, the shogun is separate from the emperor, so this is the social hierarchy ultimately of Japanese feudalism. And after that, you have the daimyos, which essentially are powerful lords, right, who own land. The lords hire samurai, who are similar in job status to medieval European knights, but not exactly the same. It's important for us to make that distinction. The samurai ultimately end up protecting the daimyos. And then you have other classes. Ultimately, it's really important for us to realize that so the Ronin are not exactly samurai, but they also exist. We tend not to really emphasize those. So if you know samurai, you're fine. The peasants represent the vast majority of the population, and similar to Tang and Song China, we see that artisans and merchants actually are lower in social status, which suggests to us that there is a Confucian influence over Japan. And it also suggests to us that ultimately the breadbasket, the food workers, are much more important status wise than the growing middle class. All right, so again, just comparing feudal Europe to feudal Japan. Now the notes are printed. Awesome. All right, so uh, first off, both systems lasted hundreds of years. Both systems had no centralized government, so to speak. Yes, there was some sort of ruler at the top of the social pyramid. In Japan, it was an emperor. In Europe, mostly it was a king, right? But Ultimately, that's more of a symbolic ruler. In some parts of Europe, really the true leader was the Pope, if they were a very religious society. But ultimately, under a feudal system, the most of the power is in the hands of the nobles, right? So that means that there's much more local rule. So you're less concerned if you're a peasant about who your king is. You're much more concerned about who your lord is. And again, if you're religious, you look to the Pope for spiritual guidance. Um, the daimyo in Japan, they were the land owning aristocrats. I already said that. So they have the supreme power over the land. That is spelled incorrectly. I just noticed. I got that image from the internet. The A comes before the I. So it's daimyo. All right. So in any case, both of these societies, both European and Japanese, feature very little social mobility. You essentially are born and die in the same class. Both are built upon hereditary monarchies, right? So the next ruler, the next head, right, the next emperor king comes from a blood relative. The Japanese social order, the names are slightly different, but they're similar, right? The serfs, that's the name for Japanese peasants, they are born into lives where they are economically dependent on their lords. The samurai are also born into their class, and their role is to protect, right? So they don't actually own land, but they have a very respected lifestyle because of their role as protector. The daimyo, again, they're born into a life of privilege. So the European social order. Peasants also are known oftentimes as serfs, right? It does depend on where you are in Europe. Let's say in Russia, peasants are essentially always called serfs, right? And then the European version of a samurai would be a knight. The European version of a daimyo would be a noble. So you can certainly use the English word. I would definitely mention samurai though, not knight. And ideally, you would be comfortable with using the word daimyo and shogun, right? You definitely need to know shogun in the future. When we talk about the Tokugawa shogunate in a little while, you have to know what a shogun is, okay? So let's just know it for now. Why not? Both these systems have some sort of code of honor, although chivalry and bushido are not exactly the same. And in both systems, of course, the peasants or serfs are the ones who work the land. They're the ones who, as I like to say, are the bread baskets of the entire society. In terms of appearance, they wear different armor. The weapon of choice for a European knight would be a sword. Oftentimes, the knights are also mounted. They ride horses. Whereas the samurai, their choice is it's still a sword, but it's a uniquely Japanese sword, the samurai sword. Very expensive, very valuable, and it takes a long time for the samurai to actually train. In terms of appearance as well, they also dress slightly differently, as we can see here. The Bushido Code. This is the code of honor for the Japanese samurai. So, the Bushido culture ultimately stresses frugality, loyalty, the martial arts, and honor unto death, right? So, we're going to contrast that with chivalry for a second. Uh, is it here? There it is. So the code of chivalry. Oh, blast! I didn't change the font. I hate Comic Sans, but that's okay. We'll survive. So in any case, the medieval code of chivalry arguably is a little bit more complex because there are more parts to it, but ultimately it's similar concepts, slightly different in practice, right? So justice, loyalty, defense, courage, faith, humility, and nobility. I like that faith is included in there. It's not that I like it, but I think it's interesting because that, I would say, is a contrast from the Japanese samurai code, which says nothing about faith or religion in it, although Buddhism is a significant faith for many samurai. One of the major differences between samurai and the nobles is that if a samurai does something to dishonor his daimyo, he is expected to commit suicide, and this is called seppuku. It is Japanese for ritual suicide. Essentially, what the samurai will do is stab himself very painfully in the stomach. There is actually a strategy to how seppuku works, but I will spare you that detail for this video. And then after a samurai commits suicide, the next step is kaishaku, which translates into seconds. As ultimately, what that means is that there's another samurai who stands by, and after seppuku, he decapitates the already dead suicide victim, right? Just to probably, I don't know, is it to ensure that he's dead or is it to ultimately express that continuation of honor? Maybe it's a little bit of both. In terms of religion, I already said that the Japanese also adopt Buddhism. They get it from China, but they do adopt their own unique form. It's called Zen Buddhism. The other form of Buddhism that we often refer to is Mahayana, and there's also Theravada. We can talk about those when we return to India in a little while. But ultimately, the Zen Buddhism is uniquely Japanese in many ways because it actually adopts Bushido values into its practice. So there's much more of an emphasis on discipline in Zen Buddhism than there is in other forms. The last thing that we need to mention is that towards the end uh, of the this feudal period of Japan, there are two different attempts by the Mongols to invade and ultimately raid Japan. The first one took place in 1274 CE, and the second one was in 1281 CE, so pretty close together. Both of these attempts, although they were very large, first off, it's fascinating that the Mongols actually boarded ships, because you tend to think about Mongols as mounted warriors on horseback. But nonetheless, they did, and they sail across the Sea of Japan, and they are unable to successfully make it because both times there are kamikazes, not to be confused with the suicide pilots of World War II. They really sort of adopt a new meaning for kamikaze there. What kamikaze actually means in this context is typhoon. So typhoons are very rough winds. They're comparable to tornadoes, although they're not exactly the same. So the Mongols were not prepared for that harsh weather, and they fail to invade Japan. So the Mongols, as we know, are much more successful in invading and taking over China. So this is the same time that the Mongol Yuan dynasty is established in China, but their attempts to get into Japan do not work. So in any case, that's it for Japan in the feudal era. We'll talk about the Tokugawa shogunate and the fourth period, even though it does actually technically begin in period 3. It just makes more sense to do it that way because for the most part the Tokugawa shogunate is in period 4. All right, so thanks so much for watching, and we will pick up shortly with videos on Korea and Vietnam. So stay tuned.